My name is Francis Gary Powers, Jr. I'll be talking today during the interview about the U-2 incident. My father, Francis Gary Powers, who was shot down May 1st of 1960 over the former Soviet Union in what's known as the U-2 incident. Talk about what happened when he was shot down, imprisoned, ultimately exchanged for Soviet spy, and some of the controversy that surrounded him upon his return home. I'll also talk afterwards about the Cold War Museum that I founded in 1996 to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, and educate kids about this time period. And finally, I'll probably mention a little bit about my book, Letters from a Soviet Prison, that details the personal correspondence of my father to his family while he was incarcerated. My father, from a very young age, probably about 10 or 11 years old, wanted to fly. He wanted to be a pilot. He had a ride in a biplane when he was about 10 or 11 years old. It hooked him. In 1950, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in order to become a pilot. He got his wings in 1952, either 52G or 52H, or a combination thereof. He was flying F-84s out of Turner Air Force Base between 1952 and 1955. And in 1955, he was recruited by the CIA to fly the new top-secret U-2 spy plane to gather photographic intelligence information from adversaries, including the Soviet Union, China, and other foreign countries. My father, after being recruited by the CIA to fly the U-2 spy plane, he was trained in Nevada at Area 51. He was then stationed in Incirlik Air Force Base near Adana, Turkey, and that's where he was primarily stationed during the next 4.5 years. The early U-2 pilots were sheep-dipped, quote unquote. They were taken out of the Air Force and put into a civilian capacity. They were still in a military quasi-unit, but back in the 1950s, it was a civilian operation. It had to be. If it was a military plane and a military pilot flying over a foreign hostile country, that would be considered an act of war. But if it was a civilian pilot in a civilian plane over a foreign hostile country, that would be sabotage. And Eisenhower intentionally wanted the CIA to run the program so that it would be a civilian program and not a military operation. But that was in the 1950s, and there was that black and white, that distinction. It was a joint military operation. The CIA and the Air Force worked together on planning the targets, the air bases where the planes were stored or based, and military personnel were used at all levels of the operation other than the pilots flying the planes and the CIA determining what targets they wanted to overfly. That information became declassified in the 1998 era, and it showed that it was a joint military operation. But back in the 1950s, it was a civilian operation, and very important for it to be a civilian operation. My father was stationed over in Incirlik Air Force Base in Turkey. He was stationed there between 1956 and 1960. During that time period, my father did 27 successful missions over the former Soviet Union and other countries, including China, Tibet, India, Pakistan, Middle Eastern countries, and Eastern European countries. The U-2 pilots, when they were recruited, were given the option of resigning from the Air Force and becoming a civilian contractor with the CIA. They resigned their commission and officially were out of the Air Force. But the contract that the pilots signed with the CIA and the Air Force basically said the following: that upon completion of their duty, they could go back into the military at a rank comparable to their peers without a loss of time or service. So while yes, they did resign from the Air Force, because of the nature of the program, they would be able to go back in the Air Force at a later date. What I would like to do is read a section from my book called Letters from a Soviet Prison. It's the personal correspondence that my father wrote to and received from family while incarcerated. In addition, it has his journal that he kept while in prison. And in his journal, he recounts the shoot-down sequence as to what took place. So I'm going to read verbatim what he wrote, and this will basically talk about in his own words what he went through when he was shot down. It was during this time that I was feeling fairly good, I was on course, the aircraft was working very good with the exception of the autopilot, and the weather was clear and navigation was fairly easy. I had been in the clear weather for 30 minutes or so, I cannot remember exactly. I had just made a turn to the northwest direction and I could see the city of Sverdlovsk up ahead. My route was just southwest of the city. After rolling out straight and level and lining up on course, I was checking my engine instruments, oxygen, etc. It was approximately 1 minute after the turn, and at the most 2 minutes, when I suddenly felt and heard a dull explosion. It was not a bang or a loud noise, but sounded like a whoomph. Everything seemed to stand still for a long time. It seemed as if time had stopped. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it seemed like at least 5 minutes to me. I remember saying to myself, maybe out loud, I don't know, "Good Lord, I've had it now." I was beginning to feel better because nothing happened. And then the right wing dropped. I picked it up with the controls, and then the nose started to go down. I pulled at the control column back, and there was no resistance to the movement. That was when I knew something was bad wrong. The nose kept going down, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Suddenly, the plane tumbled nose down, and it was here that I think I lost both wings. It is hard for me to say what happened because it happened so fast. There were several violent maneuvers which are impossible for me to describe. In a few seconds, the plane, or what was left of it with me, started spinning in an upside-down position with the nose pointing towards the sky. My suit also inflated at this time. I did not feel it inflate, just all at once realized that it was squeezing me. The spin was causing about 3 or 4 G-forces. I was being forced toward the nose of the aircraft and also towards the top of the cabin. I knew I had to get out as soon as possible if I wanted to live. I remember thinking to myself it would be best to stay with the aircraft, but rejected that idea very fast. I was very much afraid of what would happen to me if I were captured, but that would be in the future, and I had more important things which demanded my immediate attention. My first action was to reach towards the destruct switches. I knew that after activating them, I would have 70 seconds in which to leave the plane before the explosion. I then thought I had better see if I could get into the position to use the ejection seat before activating the switches. It was a good thing I did this because I spent several minutes trying to get my feet in the proper position and trying to get far enough back in the seat so that I could eject without tearing my legs off on the canopy rail as I shot out of the cabin. I could not get into the proper position. I was not sitting at all, but hanging by the seat belt, and it was impossible to shorten the belt with all the G-forces against it. All of this took a long time, it seemed to me, and I was starting to get worried. I remember talking to a friend of mine once several years before. He had had to bail out of the plane and was having trouble. He told me that he had to make himself stop fighting to get out and just think. He stopped everything and went over in his mind and decided to try another way, and it worked. Well, this is what I did. I knew I had to get out soon, and I knew I wasn't making any progress, so I just stopped to think. I remember looking at the altimeter, which was rewinding very fast. I was passing through 34,000 feet as near as I could tell. It was then that I thought I didn't have to use the ejection seat, that maybe I could open the canopy, unfasten my seat belt, and harness and climb out. Up to this time, I had only thought of the ejection seat. As far as I was concerned, that was the only way out. I immediately put the new plan into action. I ejected the canopy, which flew off without any trouble. I thought again of the destruct switches, but thought I had better see if I would be able to get out before activating them. I then released my seat belt, and the forces of the gravity threw me half out of the cabin. I would have been thrown completely out, I think, had I not forgotten to disconnect my air hose. Then I tried to get back in the cockpit. It was impossible. I tried to get to the destruct switches. Also impossible. When the canopy was ejected, my faceplate fogged up and added to my other troubles. I could only see as far as my nose. I didn't know how high I was, how long it would be before I hit the ground, or anything else. I then decided to leave the plane if possible. I gave a kick with my feet, and the next instant I seemed to be floating. I did not have a sensation of falling, but after leaving the cabin, I seemed suspended in midair. It is impossible to tell of the sense of relief that swept over me on getting away from the plane. Almost immediately upon leaving the plane, my parachute opened automatically. I had not even thought of pulling the ripcord yet. I was very surprised. I still could not see through my faceplate and did not know my altitude. Then I thought I must be below 14,000 feet, or the automatic opener of my parachute would not have worked. I knew then knew I didn't need oxygen, so I removed my faceplate. So this is the sequence of events that my father just described in his journal that he kept in prison, the bailout scene of the U-2. The U-2 was hit by the near miss of a Soviet SA-2 missile that exploded near enough to the tail section to cause structural failure. As a result, the nose pitches forward, the wings break off, my father tumbles out of the sky down towards the ground. He parachutes out of the plane once he is able to get out of the cockpit. He parachutes down to the ground. He's captured by area farmers, turned over to the local officials, who then turn him over to the KGB. My father goes through 3 months of solitary confinement and interrogations. He goes through a trial in which he is sentenced to 10 years in prison. He serves a total of 21 months in captivity before being exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel on February 10th of 1962. While my father was in captivity in the former Soviet Union, the first 3 months during the interrogations, he was kept at Lubyanka prison. Lubyanka prison is the infamous KGB prison, part of and adjacent to the KGB headquarters downtown Moscow. At this facility, there was no physical torture, but there was a lot of mental interrogations. There was bright spotlight, grueling questions, threats of death, a mutt and Jeff, for lack of a better term, and or good cop, bad cop. One KGB guy would come in, yelling and screaming, "You'll tell us everything or we'll shoot you tomorrow." The next KGB officer would come in, bring him a cup of coffee, sit down with them. "Mr. Powers, you help us, we can help you." Trying to get him to cooperate, trying to get him to reveal information that he knows. But during this interrogation, my father does not reveal any secrets. He follows orders. He cooperates with his captors. He talks about the photographic missions that he was on, which he was told to do, but he did not reference or mention anything about the equipment on board the plane or names of pilots, number of missions, and other specifications of the aircraft. He was able to keep quite a bit of information secret by playing dumb. My father, when asked what this piece of equipment was, would answer, "I don't know what this is. I am a pilot. I was hired to fly the plane." This way, he was able to avoid answering certain questions about the equipment that they were trying to figure out what it was. After the U-2 was shot down and the chunks fell out of the sky, the Soviets gathered the chunks. They examined them with a fine-tooth comb. They put the wreckage on display at Gorky Park, and the wreckage was used as evidence at my father's trial as evidence against him for his espionage activities. It's hard to tell exactly how much information they gained from the U-2, but I do know, or I assume, that the flight suit my father was wearing, that they also captured, was reverse engineered. Back in the 1990s, I was able to visit the Soviet Union. I was able to see a pressure suit, high altitude Soviet MiG fighter's pressure suit. It looked identical to the U-2 suit my father had worn. So I'm thinking that that's where they got this design parameters, was from my father's flight suit. In regards to other parts of the aircraft, they did go through it with a fine-tooth comb. They were able to develop some of the film, so they knew it was an espionage activity. The camera was busted. It was broken in little pieces and chunks, so they couldn't re-engineer that, but they could see some of the internal mechanisms. And one of the things I found very amusing about the wreckage that I've examined and seen photos of, the U-2 plane was black. It was a covert secret operation. There was no identifying markings on the aircraft. But internal, the engine, the cameras, the equipment were all stamped, made in the USA, Pratt Whitney, GE, and other defense contractors' insignias. So even had my father been able to hit the destruct button and detonated the small charge that would destroy the equipment on board, the plane wreckage would still have been noticeable and able to be reviewed. Not all of the equipment would have been destroyed, and all of these government USA markings were internal to the aircraft. So the Soviets would have known, regardless of how much of the plane was left, that it was an American spy plane. The pilots were never ordered to commit suicide if captured. Their orders were as follows. They were to maintain a cooperative attitude towards their captors. They were perfectly free to talk with them about the U-2 program and the operation of taking photographs over foreign countries. They were not to talk about the equipment on board the plane, the other pilots, or the other type of missions that were being involved. So in regards to being captured, there was no formal training or no formal review as to what to do if captured. So my father was even told during one briefing, you might as, if you're caught and captured, if something happens and you go down, you might as well tell them everything. They'll get it out of you anyways. So they anticipated that the pilots would be tortured. There were accounts of other Cold War shoot-downs where American service members were picked up by the local villagers and either threatened with pitchforks or injury had happened. So when the CIA was doing this operation, they were thinking that if someone went down, they would be tortured and information would be extracted. As a result, they came up with an idea to give the pilots a quote-unquote suicide pin. It was an optional device to take and an optional device to use at the pilot's discretion in the event of torture. My father, on this particular mission, decided to take this device with him. It was concealed in a hollowed-out silver dollar. Upon the way down, when he's parachuting to the ground, he contemplates using the device. He looks at the silver dollar. He takes the pin out of it. He throws the silver dollar away. His thinking, oh, this is going to be a souvenir that some Russian's going to want. He takes the pin, he hides it in his flight suit pocket. On the third strip search, later that afternoon, the KGB find the device. He goes, oh, be very careful with that. He did not want to have a murder conviction on top of an espionage conviction. He was already in enough trouble as it was. But this led to a theory, a conspiracy theory, that the U-2 pilots and or my father was ordered to commit suicide, that he disobeyed orders because he didn't. And that is false. There was no official orders to take the device. There was no official orders to use the device. It was at the pilot's discretion in the event of torture. Since the Soviets captured my father and found this device on him, they tested it on a dog. The dog died in 20 seconds of asphyxiation. It shut down the central nervous system. The dog appeared to die from lack of oxygen. And another thing that I found in my research is that the left hand of the government doesn't always know what the right hand of the government's doing. The right hand does not tell the pilots what the cover story is, does not order them to take the device or to use the device. And so all of a sudden, the pilot lives through this, and the President of the United States gets embarrassed because he gets caught lying to the American public about the weather research flight that this mission was on. After the Soviets test the device on a dog, Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, comes up to center stage, waves the pin in an international audience at his press conference. Look at these evil Americans. See what they give their spy pilots to kill themselves with. This one wanted to live to see another day. And from that moment on, the rumor that my father was ordered to commit suicide started to circulate around. But after 50 plus years now of declassified files, conferences, and FOIA requests, the truth has come out, and we now know that my father did everything he was supposed to do. He followed orders. He did not reveal any secret or sensitive information to the Soviets, and he was able to mislead them any way he could. While Dad was in prison, he was able to write letters to and from his family. The first 3 months of letters, probably about 3 or 4 letters in that first 3 months of interrogations during his interrogation sessions. At first, for many years, I never thought that his letters were censored. They were handwritten, they were in their entirety, pages were numbered, it looked like a letter he wrote. But then I found through his audio tapes that he recorded back in the 1960s the following. The KGB said, yes, we want you to write a letter home to your wife and your parents, letting them know that you're okay. So my dad writes a letter. They look at the letter, they review it. They change this, they cross out that, they reshift a paragraph back and forth, give it back to him, rewrite the letter. So he rewrites the letter in his own handwriting. They take that next copy, they review it, they switch a sentence, they delete a word, they switch things around. They have him rewrite it. So the third letter is in his original handwriting. It looks like an authentic letter, no censorship. He mails it home to his family. I believe that the KGB were doing that intentionally to try to prevent him from doing secret communications through the letters to the U.S. government. They were changing paragraphs, they were changing words, they were changing sentences, rewriting certain things, not changing his thoughts or his feelings, but changing the order or sequence of how they were delivered. As a result of these letters that I have in my personal possession, over the last 25 years or so, since about 1996, I have data entered them into the computer. And last year, I was able to publish these letters to his loved ones and those from his loved ones to him in this book called Letters from a Soviet Prison. So if there's people that are interested in this book, this first-hand account of Gary Powers, U-2 pilot, and what it was like to be in the Soviet prison, they can reach me in regards to my father's captivity while he was in the Soviet prisons for the 21 months, first in Vladimir, and then first in Lubyanka, and then in Vladimir. The press started to write stories about what they thought took place. And they were experts talking about the U-2 and the operations, and most of these experts didn't know anything that they were talking about. As a result, a lot of misinformation started to circulate around. There was theories and rumors and speculation that my father had defected, that he had landed the plane intact, that he had spilled his guts and told the Soviets everything he knew, or that he hadn't followed orders and committed suicide. The most likely cause of the U-2 incident, up until my father was returned home and debriefed, was that there was a flameout. That either it was sabotage and somebody intentionally sabotaged the mission to lower the altitude of the U-2 so it could be shot down, or even absurd as a UFO encounter that caused the U-2 to fall out of the sky. So there was these various rumors and speculation and reports out there circulating in the media that my father had done, had disobeyed orders or had defected, just a whole scheme of things. But fortunately, over the last 50 plus years, through declassification conferences, FOIA requests, and basically the passage of time, it's been determined that my father did not reveal any classified information. He followed orders to the fullest extent he could. He did not collaborate with the enemy, and that he was able to prevent the revealing of information to the enemy at the time. Oh, but this controversy still circulates around, because we all know that whatever you read in the press has got to be true. Today, online, whatever you read online has got to be true. So these students who do reports for their school history teachers will go to primary sources of the 1960s, where all the misinformation is. They may not know that a book about the letters from the Soviet prison was written in 2017. They may not know that there was a declassification conference available online that was hosted in 1998. They may not know that my father was posthumously awarded the POW medal for his incarceration, or even as the Silver Star for his heroics during this time period. So the record has been set straight, and the truth is out there, but there's so much information that circulates with the truth, it's sometimes hard to unveil and uncover. In addition to the POW medal and the Silver Star, Dad was also awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But all the U-2 pilots were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross while they were doing those missions. At the time, however, secret missions, the medal was presented, we'll hold this for safekeeping. And so some pilots may not yet have received the medal that was officially awarded to them in the 60s. And there's some efforts underway to get that rectified. After my father returns home from the Soviet Union, he works an additional 6 months for the CIA, training agents on what to do if captured. Then, between 1963 and 1970, he is a test pilot for Lockheed, working under Kelly Johnson at Skunk Works in Burbank, California, flying U-2s. 1970, he writes his book, Operation Overflight, that details his account of the U-2 incident. This is the copy of his autobiography. I had this republished about 10, 15 years ago, and I wrote the epilogue for it. After writing the book, his book, he's on the lecture circuit for about 2 years. Then in 1972 to 1977, he's working for radio and television stations in the Los Angeles area, flying airplanes or helicopters, reporting on news, weather, and traffic. In 1976, he starts to work for KNBC Television, flying their helicopter, reporting on news, weather, and traffic for the evening news. August 1st of 1977, my father's flying home from a mission, reporting on brush fires in Santa Barbara County, California. Helicopter runs out of gas, crashes. He and the cameraman are killed in the accident. Some people ask me, how can such a good pilot allow himself to run out of gas? Or it was sabotage that the CIA finally got my father, none of which I believe. I believe it was an accident. I believe that the fuel gauge had been misreading. My father noted this to the mechanics. I know that the helicopter was in for an overhaul the week before this August 1st mission, and that I believe that my father was flying on August 1st with the assumption he had 20 more minutes of flying time than was registered on the fuel gauge. What I believe happened is that the mechanics fixed the fuel gauge to be accurate and didn't tell my father, or Dad did not see it in the logbook, and he was flying with this assumption that he had 20 more minutes of flying time than was reading. So once you start to run out of gas in a helicopter, you can auto-rotate. Dad starts to do the auto-rotation procedure. He picks his spot. He starts to auto-rotate. He notices kids playing baseball. He doesn't want to land on top of them. He diverts. Down the helicopter goes. I was 12 years old when my father passed away in the helicopter crash. Up until that point in time, I thought it was a normal childhood. Hiking, biking, fishing. My dad taught me to play chess. My dad taught me to fish. We would go hiking in the mountains together. I'd fly with him on some of his newscast reports when he was in the airplane. So it was normal for me. I was aware that my father had been shot down, imprisoned, and exchanged. But as a kid, I didn't understand the significance of it. I thought everybody's dad had been through that. That perception changed on August 1st of '77 when my father died in the helicopter crash while working for NBC. 1992, I moved to Virginia to increase my research, to continue my research on the U-2 incident, my father, the Cold War. While attending George Mason University in Fairfax County, Virginia, I started to give lectures to high school students about the Cold War and the U-2 incident. 9 times out of 10, I'd walk into a classroom, I'd get blank stares. The kids thought I was there to talk about the U-2 rock band. So this was the first clue that something had to be done to preserve Cold War history. By 1996, I had founded the Cold War Museum to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, and educate kids about this time period. I wanted to make sure that they were aware of the duck and cover drills, that civil defense, the fears and the tensions between the Soviets and the Americans during this time period, and the other aspects of the Cold War that shaped this period of time between '46 and '91. So in 1996, I found the Cold War Museum. I'm thinking it's going to take 3 years to build. Fundraise $3 million, shouldn't be too difficult to do. Turns into a 15-year project. During that 15-year time period, we start to collect Cold War artifacts. We start to get items from Cold War veterans. Very easy to find in the mid-90s, very difficult to find now. So we were ahead of the curve when we started to collect these Cold War artifacts. In 2011, the Cold War Museum officially opened as a brick and mortar location at Vint Hill, Virginia. Vint Hill is a former Army communication base used throughout the Cold War to monitor the electronic communications of the embassies in Washington, D.C. It was a listening post, staffed by NSA, CIA, Army Security Agency, and other government agencies that needed that type of information. So it was active between 1945 and 1990s. It was then closed. It came up for redevelopment. The governor of Virginia put a task force in to help with the redevelopment issues, and it's now home to the museum, a winery, a brewery, homes. FAA has a hub. Government contractors have a presence, and there's other lands and lots available for people who are interested in that type of investment near the Washington, D.C. metro area. More information online, coldwar.org. I also want to make sure that I thank the U.S. Air Force Museum, as well as the U.S. Air Force Foundation. I'm here in Dayton this week of July to do a movie screening of The Bridge of Spies. Bridge of Spies was the movie that Steven Spielberg produced and directed about 2 years ago. The movie stars Tom Hanks as James Donovan, who he was portraying this attorney who helps to broker the exchange for the Soviet spy, Rudolf Abel, and my father. My father is portrayed by Austin Stoll, and Rudolf Abel is portrayed by Mark Reliance. Mark Reliance ends up winning an Oscar for his role in this movie. So it was a very big honor to be a part of this movie. I was a technical consultant on it. It's based on these two books, Strangers on a Bridge, that James Donovan wrote about his experiences working with the Soviet spy, being his legal counsel, and the behind-the-scenes negotiations that he did to help broker the exchange for my father. It's also based on this book, my father's autobiography, Operation Overflight, that details his account of the U-2 incident and the U-2 program. Then it's also based off some of the misinformation of the time, what was written in the press. Spielberg does a great job of helping to show in the big picture what the Cold War was about. It is historically accurate in the big picture. The duck and cover drills, civil defense, the fear and the tensions between the Soviets and the Americans, very, very well portrayed. But the details of each scene in the movie are not 100% accurate. There's some misinformation that snuck in. It keeps people on the edge of their seats. It builds suspense. And so while Spielberg does allow some of the misinformation into the movie, at the end of the movie, in the postscript, he honors my father as a hero to our country, and we're very, very grateful and honored that he had that designation in this film. From very early on, when the Cold War Museum was founded, our primary mission was to help educate the kids about this time period. So we were able to work with Fairfax County Public Schools, established a partnership with them to provide speakers to go into classrooms to give a talk on a Cold War experience, things for teachers to utilize. We also were able to design the website, coldwar.org, that's full of useful information. That website has allowed students to win, place, or show in National History Day competitions at the local, state, or national level. Students who call the museum are often put in touch with Cold War veterans who can give an oral history as part of their project. If your veterans group would like to partner with the Cold War Museum as a resource to get these stories out, I'll be glad to work with you on that going forward. But you have to remember, I am now on the exterior of the Cold War Museum. I'm no longer doing the day-to-day operations, and I have to turn you over to Jason Hall, who's our executive director. It's very important to keep Cold War history alive for future generations. And the Cold War Museum is in a very unique position to help continue that process going forward. But we do need the help and support of individuals such as yourselves who are interested in this type of a program. The Cold War Museum is a 501c3 charity. We rely on public support, foundation grants, and in-kind donations to sustain our mission and our programs. The Cold War Museum does have a program in place where they can loan out items to various museums across the country and other organizations pending approval. We always like to get our artifacts out into the public's viewing so that it just doesn't stay in a storage facility or in one location in America. We have items on loan currently to museums across the country. We have a mobile display on the U-2 incident currently at the Sac Museum in Nebraska. We have small little pieces on loan to a couple of museums around the country currently. Past organizations that we've loaned objects to include presidential libraries. So we have these very unique resources at our disposal, and we'd love for people to contact us if they're interested in getting an item for loan for a program or a project they're working on. I have been lecturing internationally now for about 20 years. I have my first book published, Letters from a Soviet Prison, that came out last year. My next book, Spy Pilot, about my father and how his reputation went from one of infamy to one of being an American hero, will be released in January of next year. If people are interested in having me over as a guest speaker for an event or activity, they can contact me online through GaryPowers.com or at my email address, gpowersjr@coldwar.org.